What's good? This is Marcus the Fingers back with another video. Today I'm going to go over the podcast that I have listened to, am listening to. I have a total of 11 podcasts where I have listened to every episode in these podcasts over the years, some of them a lot more recently. And these are the ones that I listen to on the Apple Podcast app. So I'll put an icon here somewhere. You may be able to find them on Spotify, on YouTube, other podcast apps, but you can definitely find them on the iOS or Apple Podcast app. So these are in alphabetical order. And as I talk about each of them, I'll put a logo or icon of each podcast here and go over some of the topics they address, some of the guests they've had on, and we'll go from there. So starting with the first one here, it's Bink About It podcast. Bink is an incredible producer. I've been following him, very inspiring producer over the years, decades, really. He's incredible, from Virginia. For those of you who've been following me know that I'm in Virginia, and there's a staple of Virginia producers that we follow, like up and coming Virginia producers, or other Virginia producers follow. That includes Bink, Knots Raw, Neptune's, Pharrell, Chad, Timbaland, Missy Elliott, and then when you start going to like DC, you get the go-go influences in Maryland and those influences. So Bink is an incredible producer from Virginia. I miss Teddy Riley, of course. Forgot Teddy Riley. But Bink started a podcast. It's called the Bink About It podcast. Currently only has 3 episodes, so you can catch up real quickly. KLC, incredible producer, was on the first episode. Cypher Sounds was on the second episode. And Royce the 5'9" is on the latest episode. Incredible MC, rapper. A lot of you may know him from Slaughterhouse, but from Michigan, rapper from Michigan. But incredible songwriter, lyricist. I don't want to go into too much detail, but the Bink podcast, you can get some insightful information, Bink About It podcast, on how some of these guys came up, some of the music, their influences, how they've connected with some of the most game-changing artists in the music industry, how some of these iconic songs have come in to play, how some songs might have been meant for someone else and then someone else snatched it up, or somehow they grabbed it. So incredible stories. And that's the Bink About It podcast. Definitely check that out. Next is Blapchat. Blapchat is a podcast that I've been listening to for I don't know if they've been going for, I don't want to say the wrong time, maybe, I don't know if it's been 10 years. It used to be called Blap on the Radio, maybe 7-8 years ago, and I've been listening to them since then. Illmind, incredible producer. He has incredible sound kits, amazing guy. And he had this podcast idea he started several years ago, and it sort of evolved into Blapchat over the years, and that is the current name of the podcast. They've had, basically they talk about music production. It's hosted by Illmind, Love Perfection, Atlas the Plug, and an incredible artist, Glam. Glam is here. Those 4 sort of have curated this podcast experience where they're interviewing producers, engineers. I believe there's an episode with a music supervisor from Insecure, and just all these industry-related people, musicians. I think, I don't know how many episodes. I think they're at over 100 episodes right now. So you have some catching up to do, but some insightful information. Some of my favorite interviews were S1, Symbolic One. He's been on there, I think, a couple of times, at least twice, if not more. Murder Beats has been on there recently. Even during these times, they did a remote interview with him. Just Blaze was on an episode. Jay White did it, was on an episode. And one of my favorite ones actually was with Brian Michael Cox, which he was on an episode, I want to say, a couple years ago. He just goes into this discussion on music publishing, and he really breaks it down. I had to listen to that episode like 3 or 4 times to sort of get a better understanding of music publishing, and he really breaks it down. But there's some incredible episodes. Blapchat, definitely check that one out. Next up, this one is not music related, but actually sort of is music related. Not sort of rap, hip hop, pop, R&B music related. This is more composing. It's called Blockbuster. And basically it is helmed by Matt Schrader, And it's a almost like an audio movie is the best way I can explain it. It's they have 2 seasons out. The first season is basically like an origin story. So the first season was the origin story of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, and Matt and his team and the whole Blockbuster team sort of got these actors to come in, incredible actors from like films and TV shows, to play these characters, and it's a really great way to sort of experience how these incredible movie directors and composers came to be. So the first season is about Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and John Williams is in there, obviously. And the second season, the current season they're on right now, is focused on James Cameron, and how he sort of got his start going into the industry. It's incredible. Like I said, it's basically like an audio movie. Definitely check it out. Blockbuster podcast. Next up is Cuff Podcast. So this is a podcast that's it's based off of a card game called the Cuff Cards. And these cards are basically like icebreakers where you can have cards that are relationship questions that you can bring up if you're in a family gathering or meeting with friends or just having a good night out. Pull the cards out and just pull a card out and answer questions. So the podcast is basically them doing that. They pull out a card. I think there's 3 or 4 people, and they just basically discuss the topic of that card. I think there's only a handful of episodes there, but shout out to Emil Barnes, who created the Cuff Cards, which sort of spun off into this podcast, Cuff Podcast. Definitely check that out. Next is Cymatics. Cymatics is an incredible team of audio producers, engineers, guys led by Steven and Drew Cymatics, who put out these incredible sound packs for producers to use. They have events around the world that producers can attend to get some live, interaction, connections and things. And they also have this podcast where they're interviewing producers, some of which I've already mentioned. S1 is on one. Curtis King, another incredible producer and YouTube person who shares sound kits. He was on an episode. Stephen Slate, who makes incredible plugins, was on an episode. Kara, who you may have some of her vocal sounds from Splice. I think she's the top vocal or top seller from Splice. She was on an episode. So they have all these different producers, singers, songwriters, musicians come in on their podcast, or it might just be them talking about, music production and music techniques and things like that. But Cymatics podcast, definitely check that one out. Next is another, going back to composing a little bit, is called Disney Four Scores, FOR, Disney Four Scores. And this is a podcast that is hosted by John Burlingame, who's an incredible music journalist over the years. He's written on all kinds of music, and he hosts this podcast, and it's basically him interviewing all of these composers and musicians from Disney projects, but it's not solely focused on Disney projects. It can be, they may talk about other projects they work on, not necessarily Disney, but they bring it back to the Disney related. But it's not just sort of Disney Channel. It's pretty much any Disney brand. So they may interview a composer who worked on an ABC film, or Marvel film, or ABC show, Marvel film. They may interview someone who's working on some shows for like Hulu or Disney Plus. So just basically anything under the Disney umbrella. Those composers are on this Disney Four Scores podcast. Composers have included Pinar Toprak. She's an incredible composer. Harry Gregson Williams, who's done amazing films. He's incredible. John Powell, Randy Newman, who we all know and love, most from Toy Story, but he's done, all kinds of stuff. And many others. I think they're at season 2 right now in the Disney Four Scores podcast. So another incredible one. Next is Oprah's Masterclass. This one I think I found 2 years ago, and I don't think there are recent episodes, but they still have I think close to 50 episodes. And basically what it is another, this is not music related, but Oprah's Masterclass podcast is basically her interviewing celebrities, and they're just talking about their origin story, how they got started, how they got to where they are now, and some things that inspire them. Like I said, there's almost 50, if not over 50. Some of my favorites have included Jay-Z, The Rock or Dwayne Johnson, Alicia Keys, Steve Harvey, Kevin Hart, and Dr. Maya Angelou. There are podcast episodes featuring those people and many more. I think John Bon Jovi's on one, Suzanne Summers. So there's a huge long list, and I'm missing a lot of them. But definitely check out Oprah's Masterclass. Next is Score, the podcast. So there is a film that came out, I want to say maybe 1 or 2 years ago, called Score, the documentary. And it was a film featuring composers and basically going in, getting some inside information from composers and how they approach scoring films. So that sort of spun off. Score, the documentary, was spun off into this podcast called Score, the Podcast, which is hosted by Robert Kraft, who is a former Fox, I believe, music supervisor. Sorry, I'm probably butchering your title and roles right now. And Kenny Holmes, and also composer Carol, as she's so lovingly called on the show. They sort of helm the Score, the podcast episodes. Another one where they interview composers, and they're currently on season 3. Some of my favorite episodes were with Pinar Toprak again, Joe Trapanese, Michael Abels, Diane Warren, who we've all heard her songs over the years. Lauren Baff, incredible composer. Ramin Javadi, I always mess up his name, composer, who obviously Game of Thrones fame, but Ramin was on an episode. The current episode I'm actually listening to right now, I'm going to get back to listen to it when I'm done with this video. The current episode is with Terrence Blanchard, who has worked on one of Spike Lee's main collaborators on his films, and Alex Lacamoire, who is the composer for Hamilton, which is coming out on Disney Plus this Friday. They got him in for this episode, the current episode. But definitely check out Score, the podcast, for incredible insight into how some of these scores are made, some stories. I would share some of them, but I don't want to spoil the secrets. Definitely check them out. Next on the list, we're almost getting there. I think there's only 3 more. So Soundiron podcast. Soundiron is a company that makes incredible VSTs, virtual instruments, for composers, music creators, producers, audio people to use in their productions, in their work. And they have a podcast where they interview composers. They talk about music production, music composing techniques, or they highlight one of their sound libraries and how those can be used, how they were created, things like that. Some my favorite interviews on the Soundiron podcast include Blake Ewing, who's done a lot of great presets for the Soundiron libraries. Jason Graves, who has probably the best name in the industry to be composing for the films and games that he composes for. His name is Jason Graves, and he's basically your go-to person for horror soundtrack. So if you want to do like thriller movies, video games, horror soundtracks, he has that on lock. Jason Graves. I read an incredible interview with him. He was on a Soundiron episode. Gareth Coker was on an episode of the Soundiron podcast, and Jordan Rudess, one of the most incredible keyboardists in the world, was also on an episode discussing sort of his production techniques and things like that. So Soundiron podcast, definitely check that one out. Next is the Soundtrack Academy by Johnny Armandari, probably messing up that name also, but the Soundtrack Academy, I believe there's an online sort of training that producers and composers can sign up for. You can get some classes and things, but the podcast, he sort of goes into music production, music composing, just more insight into the music production process. And the Soundtrack Academy, what actually I've been sharing from them lately to a lot of different websites and things, is they have a list of free libraries that you can download to help you with your productions, high quality like string libraries, percussion stuff, and I've been sharing that. I have it as a list that I have of free libraries that I send to people when they're looking. So Soundtrack Academy, definitely check out that podcast. And last but not least, the Bedroom Super Producer Podcast. Was it last year or 2 years ago? My wife bought me a book for Father's Day. that was called The Bedroom Super Producer, I believe is the name of the book, by JT Cloutier, aka Delicate Beats. Sort of a spinoff from this book is this podcast they have. I believe there is a YouTube channel, but I listen to it on the podcast app, obviously. Currently, they're at I want to say over 20 episodes. They haven't had any guests yet, but they do talk about topics such as there was an episode on Murder Beats, and his production. There was an episode on Hans Zimmer, episode on the Neptunes. There was an episode on Jay Dilla, sort of their insight into his production. There was an episode on Billie Eilish. There was an episode on John Williams. So they have episodes that focus on these different topics related to music creation, music production, music composing, and the careers of some of these individuals and groups, and how they got to where they are. So if I can figure it out, I'm going to put a list of all of the podcasts I mentioned here. There are 11 of them. Running through them one more time. Bink About It podcast, Blapchat, Blockbuster, Cuff podcast, Cymatics, Disney Four Scores, Oprah's Masterclass, Score the podcast, Soundiron podcast, Soundtrack Academy, and the Bedroom Super Producer podcast. Those are the 11 podcasts where I have listened to every episode. Some of them they might not be making new episodes. Some of them they're cranking out episodes monthly, weekly, or as their schedules fit. But those are the 11 that I'm following. Thank you for checking this out. More music on the way, more videos on the way. Be safe and be well. All right, peace.